I think we're ready to start. Everybody okay to start? Well, welcome. Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to this event. The title of the event is the Biden Administration's Immigration Policies, a Review. For those that do not know me, my name is Rosa Steloria, and I serve at UW Law School as Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies. And it's a wonderful pleasure to be with all of you this morning. And I want to welcome our speakers today with a very important note of gratitude because they're both incredibly busy and they're so generous with their time and their knowledge. And I'm extremely grateful, that they're always available, to brief not only our community, but also basically all of our friends and contacts and partners on what's happening in immigration law today. So I want to start by introducing Alberto Benitez. He's actually a professor of clinical law here at UW Law School, and he's the director of our immigration clinic. And before joining UW Law School, he was on the faculty of the legal clinics at Chicago Kent College of Law and Northwestern University. And prior to becoming a clinician, he was a staff attorney at the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law and the Legal Assistance Foundation of Chicago, as well as an intern at the Centro de Estudios Legales y Sociales in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And in addition, in the summers, he has taught at the law schools of the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM, and the Universidad Panamericana in Mexico City. And I'm also super proud to present Anam Ranam, who's a partner at the law firm Calderon Seguin PLC, located in Fairfax, Virginia. And we're extremely proud and honored to have her as one of our alums. Her immigration practice covers a broad array of matters, including non-immigrant and immigrant visas, family-sponsored petitions, waivers of inadmissibility, asylum, humanitarian relief, and all forms of relief from removal. Anam specializes in asylum and removal defense, including direct representation of detained individuals, and regularly appears before the Arlington and Baltimore immigration courts. And she also represents clients in seeking affirmative and appellate matters before various agencies and federal courts. And she's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law School. There are a number of issues that our panelists are going to be covering today. One of them really focuses around developments in the area of immigration law, institutions and procedures now under the Biden administration. They're also going to be discussing where immigration matters are heading in the United States based on contemporary events and modern events and areas in which we need reform. And they're going to continue one underlying issue that we always discuss in immigration law events, yearly. And one of them is the connection between everything related to immigration law in the United States and also racial and structural discrimination issues. And they're also going to discuss the potential impact of the global refugee crisis created by the Russia-Ukraine war in the practice of immigration law in the United States. And lastly, they're going to be discussing also the role of U.S. legal education in all of these matters. I always share a personal note, when we discuss immigration law issues at events. I'm actually the daughter of an immigrant. My dad was actually a Cuban immigrant. He fled Cuba in the 1960s, and he was fleeing an autocratic and repressive regime. And he was really seeking a better life for him, and his family. And for him, when I talked to my dad, he was always talking about how the United States is the land of freedom and hope and opportunity and potential. And he's now deceased. And I must confess that every time we have an event like this, I remember him so much. And especially now with all the images of Ukrainian refugees on TV, I've had him in my mind a lot lately. So I must confess that as I moderate this event today and as I share this panel with these wonderful speakers. I thank you all for being here and for being interested in such important issues. I also want to thank the Immigration Law Society at UW Law School, who has and is co-sponsoring this event. And I want to start with the first question for Anam, actually. And I want to ask you to please describe recent developments in U.S. immigration law and what you understand are the main challenges in the present.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dean. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here on this panel with you and Professor Benitez. And I appreciate that sweet note about your father. And I think it's something that we can all kind of keep in mind as we discuss some of the technicalities today, is that at the heart of immigration law are people and really compelling stories. And as we talk about some of these more technical matters, it's good to just remind that that's really where the heart of immigration law lies, is with helping people and protection. So to answer your question, it's a great question. With a very thorny, complicated answer as far as recent developments in immigration law. So I actually want to back up a little bit and just provide a little bit of context potentially for those who aren't as familiar with immigration law. So immigration law, the bases are kind of trifold. We have legislation, and that's primarily the Immigration and Nationality Act. But then we also have a lot of case law that can be from our Supreme Court, our courts of appeals, and going down to administrative levels as well. And then finally, we have so much of immigration law which is rooted in the executive branch. And that really is what makes immigration law very unique, but also quite vulnerable to political pressure and who's in the White House. And so we see that immigration law, perhaps more than other fields, really malleable, and it really changes based on who is sitting in the White House and who that person has armed in their cabinet. So with that in mind, I'll just give some very broad strokes about some developments that we've seen during the Biden administration. There has been a lot, but the Biden administration has been criticized with not doing enough in immigration by a lot of advocates, but they have been quite busy as well. And actually, in relation to the Trump administration, they've been busier. So just as one statistic to give you, the Migration Policy Institute logged 296 executive actions by the Biden administration in the first year, and that's in comparison to 86 executive actions taken by the Trump administration during the same time. So that's just something to keep in mind. And again, the executive actions in immigration play a role because immigration is, kind of nestled within the purview of the executive branch. And so the president does have a lot of power to make some small changes. So just to highlight a few of those changes, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I'll speak on it in kind of broad strokes. There has been a great change in interior enforcement in a really favorable way. There have been less interior arrests, less detention, and so that's been a really positive development that we've seen during the Biden administration. And that's been one tool that they've used to lower the rates of detention and arrests have been a higher use of prosecutorial discretion. During the Trump administration, everyone was a priority for enforcement, detention, and arrest. And so what the Biden administration kind of reverted back to, but also made a little stronger, they fortified it, was having priorities of people and acknowledging that there are many people undocumented in the United States, and the government simply doesn't have enough power, enough resources to go after all of them. So let's prioritize the people that we should prioritize and not use our very limited resources for people who aren't priorities for us. So that interior enforcement has really been a positive development. We've also seen some positive developments in humanitarian protection. New countries have been designated for temporary protected status, including Myanmar and Venezuela, and most recently Ukraine. And other countries have also continued their designation for temporary protected status. And what temporary protected status does is allow people to stay in the United States temporarily in acknowledgement of some humanitarian basis for them to stay. And we have also seen some easing of the restrictions and impediments to asylum seekers in the United States. The Trump administration made it much more difficult for certain asylum seekers fleeing gang violence and domestic violence to obtain asylum. And some of those impediments have been eased, making it a little easier for people to obtain protection under those bases. Another positive development that we saw is that people who qualify for U visas, who are victims of certain crimes, who have been aiding law enforcement. They're in this endless backlog because Congress has a cap of only 10,000 visas in that category. And there are about 160,000 pending U visas right now at the end of fiscal year 21. So you can do the math there as to how long that backlog is. It's easily over 10 years now. And ordinarily, these people were in limbo with no status or work authorization. And now during that waiting time, they have an opportunity to at least obtain work authorization so that they can work to protect those families. And that has really had a really positive effect on these vulnerable immigrants who deserve protection. The DACA program has been fortified, so we'll see if that fortification will help them with this ongoing litigation. Those are the DREAMers, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And then we also have seen a rise in refugee caps. So I want to also end on one note, which is border enforcement. And this has been the one area that the Biden administration has received a lot of criticism on. And that refers primarily to Title 42, which the Biden administration has continued implementation of. It started during the Trump administration, which allows them to expel many people at the border who are trying to enter. Often, many of them are asylum seekers with valid claims. And so there has been a very high amount of expulsions relying on Title 42. And that seems to be something that we will see more of. And they're primarily relying on, the pandemic and CDC guidance to continue Title 42, but the Biden administration has rightfully received a lot of criticism on the continuation of that policy. Of course, I would be remiss to not mention the Biden administration's attempts at some immigration reform with the Build Back Better Act. This did pass in the House, but it has been stalled in the Senate. Its passage seems quite unlikely, especially with the immigration provisions that most of us would like to see in it. But that was something that was passed. It was done quite early in the Biden administration. Personally, I'm not very optimistic that we will see comprehensive immigration reform through that particular piece of legislation, but we'll see what happens.
Thank you, Anam, so much for that insight. And Alberto, I have a connected question for you. I mean, you've been practicing immigration law for a very long period of time. You have worked with a number of US administrations in this practice. How do you think the practice of immigration law looks like today under the Biden administration? If you could share some thoughts for us on that.
Sure. Thank you, Dean Salorio. First, if I may, thank you, Dean Salorio. Thank you, Anam. It's an honor to be on a panel with the both of you. A shout out also to my friend, colleague, Professor Vera, who's joining us as well. Also a distinguished GW Law alum. If I could, Dean Salorio, take 10 seconds more. In your beautiful story about your father, you talked about potential, that your father talked about how this country was a country of potential. And that really struck with me because as you know, and as many know, I also am the son of immigrants. And my family came to this country for the same reason many of us had family or ourselves came. And here we are doing whatever it is that we do. So this really is the land of opportunity. And I'm very grateful for everyone who wants to come and better themselves and better their children's lives. My introduction to immigration law as a thing was back in 1984, after my first summer as a law student. So that was during the Reagan administration. I've seen a few administrations, obviously both parties. Both parties have had good things that they've done in immigration and bad things that they've done in immigration. The classic example that I always use, that in 1986, a conservative Republican president, Ronald Reagan, signed a massive legalization or amnesty bill, however you want to describe it, that gave lawful permanent residence to millions and millions of people who were out of status in the United States. 10 years later, in 1996, a progressive or a liberal Democratic president, Bill Clinton, signed one of the most restrictive pieces of immigration legislation in history. the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, many of which the provisions we're still suffering under to this day. That said, the prior administration was in a whole different category, And I want to share with you my historical perspectives, if I could. That's the one thing I can perhaps share here. The change between the prior administration and the Biden administration, I look at it this way. I'm not scared after I wake up in the morning to turn on my phone or to log on to find out what is the latest outrage that the administration has unleashed on the country and on the world of non-citizens. You know the history just as well as I do. And the Muslim travel ban, the changes to the public charge rules, the breakup of families, we could go on and on and on and on and on. Doesn't happen anymore. It doesn't happen anymore in large part because there's one person that's no longer working in the government, an individual by the name of Stephen Miller, whose sole purpose in life was to be cruel and inhuman to non-citizens. He was the moving force behind this agenda. I don't know that he had anything else on his docket in the White House. He had 4 years to do great harm to the immigration system as we know it and as Anam described beautifully. The current administration has been in office a little bit over a year, and we all know that it's much easier to destroy things than it is to build things up. In addition, you have notice and comment requirements that block a lot of legislation that needs to be done. You have judges who have a particular ideology who are blocking things that the current administration is trying to do. I give the current administration and the various individuals that President Biden has appointed, Secretary Mayorkas, himself an immigrant to the United States, with doing a lot to undo the bad things that were done in 4 years. I subscribe to what Anam said, that many of us in the community want and expect that the administration should have done more. We always want more. And I am hopeful and I'm optimistic that the administration will continue to undo and then do positive things. There's a sort of bits and pieces that people like me sort of look for to keep optimism going. If I'm not mistaken, yesterday or the day before, the administration announced that it was not going to apply Title 42 restrictions to unaccompanied minors. So we're not going to kick out unaccompanied minors from the United States, which shouldn't be something that we get too excited about. It should be something that we just do as a matter of course, but baby steps. So those are my thoughts on your excellent question, Dean Salodian.
Thank you so much, Alberto. And within that historical context and what's happening in the present, I have a question for Anam, and it's a question that many of us have in our minds. I mean, we have been watching very closely the events related to the Russia occupation of the Ukraine and the human toll, the massive refugee crisis, the magnitude of the suffering. And many of us are wondering, what kind of impact that's going to have in immigration law in the United States and in the practice of immigration law in the United States. So if you could share some thoughts on that, that would be great.
I would be happy to. Thank you. That's really a great question. And I'm sure it's really on the forefront of many of the participants' minds. So to answer your question succinctly, immigration law will be impacted by what is going on in Ukraine, rightfully so. Immigration law always has to be responsive to global events, and especially when there is war and civil unrest and upheaval, and when people are forced to flee their countries with little notice and little planning. So I think that this is something that will be felt certainly around the world, not only the United States, but as a country that can be safe to people who are fleeing violence and persecution, the United States will certainly be feeling that. So we've already seen some changes, and one really positive development that happened early is the announcement of Ukraine's designation for temporary protected status. But it is important to note the limitation of that benefit, which is that it only benefited people who are already in the United States as of the date that the announcement was made. So it's not forward-looking, unfortunately, and Ukrainians who will be coming to the US in the coming months will not, unfortunately, be able to benefit from temporary protected status. It's nonetheless positive. For example, it would really help someone who's on an F1 student visa studying at GW Law and May graduation is coming up and this person does not feel safe or have an ability to return back to his or her country. They could rely on temporary protected status to give them a temporary stay in the United States and eligibility for work authorization due to that war. I also am hopeful in that, I mean, we will be receiving more people from Ukraine, people who are fleeing for their lives and want to seek asylum. And I think for us who practice asylum law, know the unfortunate reality that many of them will not qualify. The requirements for asylum are quite strict. You have to show a fear of persecution on account of a protected ground, which is your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, your membership in a particular social group, or your, I believe I missed race, nationality. So oftentimes people who are fleeing war might not have a basis under one of those protected grounds to show why you will be singled out and suffer that persecution. Of course, arguments can be made and each case is different, but for someone who kind of just comes to the United States and says things are really bad in my country, there's a war, might not be able to fit within the 5 corners of that asylum definition. So I hope that what will happen is that with this global and national attention and with people who come to seek protection in our country but are unable to qualify, it makes all of us look at this system and its flaws and its inadequacies, and we need to rethink about it because these people are clearly deserving of protection. But if the United States doesn't have a way to provide that, then we need to really think about how we can reform it. And that would help many people, not just people from Ukraine, but other people from other countries who also merit our protection. So I'm really hoping that, you know, with this turmoil that the whole world is watching and a lot of people feel very strongly about, we help Ukrainians who need protection, but we also think of the brown and Black immigrants who also have been suffering from many similar humanitarian issues and look at this system and how we can fix it so that they can all get the protection that they deserve.
Thank you, Anna, so much for this. And you touch on a very important point, right? The element of racial discrimination, not only in the history, but in the present, you know, of immigration issues. And Alberto, if you could expand more on that specific issue in particular, especially when it comes to the practice of immigration law today in the United States.
Sure. The question made me think and ponder and try to sort of dig out the cobwebs, but I'm pretty sure that I'm correct that there's nothing in the Immigration and Nationality Act that refers specifically to color. It doesn't have, obviously, distinctions like that. Race, there is, Anna mentioned one of the 5 categories for asylum, but otherwise, I don't remember anything in the statute or in the 8 Code of Federal Regulations that talks about race as such. However, one of the points that I make in my immigration law class is that U.S. immigration law is affected by what happens abroad. Anna pointed that out. But U.S. immigration law is also affected by what happens within the United States, because the same legislators who are blocking voting rights and blocking, doing a lot of other things, are not prepared to pass immigration reform legislation, such as Anna pointed out. So there are clearly things that we can say that the law itself may be neutral. I'll throw that out. The law is neutral, but how is it applied? And in thinking about your question, Dean Celorio, I kept two situations in very recent history kept coming to mind. Number one, the situation in Ukraine. We've all seen the tragic video and stories and photographs of refugees going into Poland and Moldova and Hungary, and TPS being announced for Ukrainians, with the way Haitians were treated back in September and October of 2021. We all remember, or may remember, that there were many Haitians trying to get into the United States, fleeing, not war in Haiti, but dire situations. And many of them were turned back. Many of them were sent back to Haiti, given a bag with some snacks and said, you're on your own. I try to do a little bit of research for today, and it's a few thousand, many thousand. They're in the thousands of the number of Haitians who were returned to their country. In the social media and so forth, there's been a discussion about how there's a legitimate empathy for refugees from Ukraine these days. No one disputes it. But there's a thread that's been said, well, they tend to look like us. So maybe we're more sympathetic to them because we can identify. I mean, they have luggage like us. They shop at stores like us. Their buildings may look like ours. And maybe we have an identity or identification with these refugees that we may not have with people of color from Haiti or people of color from Central America. I've been listening closely to the language surrounding the refugee crisis in Ukraine, both from the administration and those others who support the current president of Russia. And I've not heard anyone describe the refugees fleeing Ukraine as a caravan. I've not heard them. They've been described as refugees fleeing a war of aggression and trying to save themselves and save their children, save their pets as well. So everyone needs to decide sort of their own perspective on this, but I just point out the historical record for people to decide for themselves.
Thank you, Alberto. And within all these very complex and intricate issues, Anna, you mentioned some areas that need reform, and it would be so great if you pick 3 that you think are a priority, and you could discuss a little bit why you think those 3 areas need particular reform when it comes to U.S. immigration law.
Sure, thank you. I think that we could probably have a 3-day conference on all of the areas for immigration reform, but I will try to be as succinct as possible as to the 3 areas that I think are really warranting of some urgent action. So first, I believe that we need a path to permanent residency and citizenship for the undocumented people in our country. That's just an acknowledgement of the millions who reside here in the United States, contribute to our country, contribute to our economy, pay taxes, have strong community ties and family ties in this country. And we need to find a way to bring them out of the shadows and offer them a path to permanent residency and citizenship. And not only will these people benefit from being able to live their lives outside of the shadows, but the country itself will be stronger because of it. So that really needs to be part of any immigration reform is a path to status for those who are undocumented. Another really important area for immigration reform, in my opinion, because I practice in the courts, is to reform the immigration court system. It suffers from really profound structural and fundamental problems. And we need Congress to enact a solution that will go to the heart of it. And really what many people don't know is that the immigration court system is part of the executive branch. It's part of Department of Justice. So as a result, it's really vulnerable to political pressure and improper influence. And we saw that during the Trump administration. We saw that through Stephen Miller, and we saw that through the many attorney generals that were part of that administration. But there was consistency in that there were some really horrible changes that were made to the court system. One example of that is that immigration judges had quotas. on how many cases that they needed to adjudicate and in how many cases they needed to deny. And so we've actually, now we have statistics to cover during that time through TRAC, T-R-A-C. And we can actually see that during the Trump administration, the same immigration judges denied many more cases than they did pre-Trump and that they did post-Trump. So that really, you know, raises eyebrows as to that improper influence. So the solution there would be to create a court system under Article 1 of the Constitution that would not be as vulnerable to political pressure and would also ensure due process for immigrants who appear before it. And that's really what it needs to come down to, is that we need to assure that these proceedings are fundamentally fair. And right now, the weaknesses in the system, which include the backlog, which include judges who deny 97% of claims before them, we really need to have an independent judiciary for cases where the stakes are so high. And finally, my last proposal or area for immigration reform would be to eliminate the detention system. We just need to not be using detention as a deterrence for immigration and explore alternatives to detention and other community-based alternatives. We should make sure, of course, the people who are serious threats to national security or public safety, you know, use detention, if at all, in a very, very limited sense for people where the government has shown, and the burden should be on the government to prove that they are serious threats to us. Otherwise, we really need to use alternatives to detention to ensure that these people are pursuing their claims in a humane way.
Thank you so much, Anam. And when you were speaking, I was thinking a lot also of international law and human rights law. A lot of what you're recommending, you know, a lot of our students ask, you know, what's the connection between immigration law and international law, you know, and a lot of human rights statements that are coming from the United Nations, from the regional protection systems on immigration law, they allude to issues like the ones that you just mentioned. So at the end of the day, we're not just talking about the need to reform the system, but the human rights of millions of people that are affected, you know, by the lack of reform. And hopefully you're heard, Anam. You know, I always hope that you continue growing and that voice is really, really heard by the decision makers at the end of the day, you know. And Alberto, I have a last question for you, but before I ask, I wanted to tell the members of our audience that we will have some time for questions and answers. So if you have any sort of questions, this is your opportunity to write them in the chat. We have these wonderful speakers, and I'm pretty sure they would love to hear your questions. Alberto, if you could actually discuss a little bit with us the role of legal education in all of this, since you're a clinician and you have so many years of practicing immigration law in the education setting.
Well, thank you, Dean Solorio. Half joking, half serious, I say that my role doing whatever it is that I do is not turning any of my students off from the practice of immigration law. Anam is with us, Professor Vera is with us, because I'm curious. I've been scrolling who else is with us. I see a few of my alums have joined us. So again, half joking, half serious. Seriously, what is the role of legal education? When I was in law school, I'm not going to tell you when that was, but I think I told you earlier, there was no Immigration Law 1 class offered. There was an immigration clinic, which is very different from the immigration clinic that we have here at GW and at most of the law schools. And now at GW, we have several sections of Immigration Law 1. We have Refugee and Asylum. We have Immigration Law 2. We have Crimmigration class. We have the Immigration Clinic. And I think that's pretty much the way it is across the board regarding immigration cases. So I tip my hat to the law school curriculum people who have seen that there's a need for more and more immigration law courses. I know Anam teaches a class at Georgetown. This is important. Second, legal education. Back in the day when I was a student and a young lawyer, immigration law was not seen as a serious area of law. It was something that you did sort of as ancillary to your primary area of law, whatever it may have been. I mean, as we often heard, those of us who practice immigration law, Immigration law was just about forms. You just fill out a form and you send it in, and it's not that hard, right? He just wants a green card. So how can he get a green card? Is there a form for that? Fortunately, many of my colleagues and people that are interested in immigration have turned it in, have educated that it's a serious, complicated area of law. Some people say, and I would agree with them, it's more complicated than tax, trying to figure out the ins and the outs and the ups and the downs and the changes of what immigration law is. So it's a serious area of law to be treated seriously, practiced by serious people, which leads to my third point regarding the education aspect of it. And that is, back in the day, how to put this? The quality of the immigration bar perhaps was not all it could have been and should have been. Fortunately, thanks to people that are now studying immigration law, many of them have told Professor Veda and myself that they came to law school to become immigration lawyers, taking the courses, doing the internships, practicing. It's seen as a viable, serious, complex area to practice on all levels, administrative and including in the federal court. GW Law is honored to have alums not only in private practice, in academia, in government, in public interest. So I think that education starts in school, and then everyone takes it from there.
Thank you so much, Alberto. And thank you so much both to you and Anam for all of these insightful remarks. And now we have actually a number of questions in the chat. So I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to ask them. We have a first question from Joshua Cunningham, one of our students. He's asking, do any of the panelists have thoughts on R1 visas for temporary religious workers? This provision was just renewed in the new budget, but the policy was set to expire a few weeks ago. That's the first time.
So I can speak briefly to that. Professor Benitez, feel free to add anything. I mean, R1 visas are one way for religious workers to come to the United States. It's a non-immigrant visa, which means it is temporary. It doesn't necessarily give a path to a green card. I'm not aware of any provision that was renewed in the budget. I mean, I know that typically anyone who qualifies for the R1 can apply for it. So I can't speak too much about, budget considerations or anything that was set to expire. My understanding is that the R1 has been there as a non-immigrant option for many, many years. It is codified in the CFR. So it's not really something that is really too malleable for change. And so I don't know of any material changes to that process.
We have a second question, and this is from the wonderful Paulina Vera, Professor Vera. She asked, because we have many students here, what can law students do to push for immigration reform?
I'll take a first crack at this one. Register to vote and then vote. Know who you're voting for. Ask your candidate, ask your senator, ask your representative, what's your stand on DACA? What's your stand on amending the definition of, or expanding the definition of asylum? What's your stand on detention, mandatory detention? I do think that while we're much better informed about immigration law, there's still this phenomenon that comes up that sort of masses of people don't really think about immigration law until it affects someone that they know. Maybe a friend or a family, and then they come to people like Anam, to Professor Veda, myself, and they say, this is outrageous. This person is a lovely person, works hard, takes care of her kids. Now she's detained. What are we going to do? And it's like, well, there's this thing called mandatory detention, and that's ridiculous. That's absurd. Who did this? So it's like, well, your Congress did this about 25 years ago. Did you know this? No, I didn't know anything about this. I have this dream that one of these days, along with all the legitimate issues that candidates are asked, like education and tax policy and foreign policy, that immigration will be right up there as an issue where candidates are going to receive votes or not going to receive votes.
I think that's really great advice. My only other tip is I recommend that students who are interested in immigration and want to push for immigration reform to join the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA. It is either free or very, very cheap for law students, and it is very not cheap for everyone else who has a license. So I would take advantage of that low to no cost as you're a law student. And they do a lot of really great work with mobilizing and, organizing days on the Hill and just sending out policy memos and action plans for those who want to push on immigration reform.
Thank you both. I have a question here from Rambet Tower, and he's asking, we see massive numbers of Ukrainian refugees being accepted by European countries, but no reports of any being accepted by the United States. And he asked, would parole visas be available for them? And there's another part of the question. He goes, I will, and no, that's it. That's it.
So I hear the concern, and I share it about the United States not really having done enough thus far to help Ukrainian refugees fleeing violence and war. Parole is an option, certainly, for people who are fleeing Ukraine. It was used with a lot of Afghans who were also fleeing Afghanistan recently when the Taliban took over. But the system is just not working the way that it should be. There is a serious backlog of parole applications that have not been adjudicated in a timely manner. But it could be used and it should be used, but it needs to be more effectively used to actually provide viable protection to all of these people who are fleeing violence and need protection. I do think that there's a second part to the question, is that if a decision were to be made, wouldn't there be criticism that similar decisions weren't made for other asylum seekers under similarly desperate situations? And I do think that that is a valid criticism. I think that the way that the United States and much of the world is talking about the Ukrainian crisis in comparison to other humanitarian crises is very telling, which is not to say that Ukrainians do not deserve our action and our sympathy. They rightfully do, but there were other vulnerable populations from other countries who have not gotten the same sympathy. And you see that even with the way that articles are being written and the way politicians are speaking about this. And again, it is not to say that they do not deserve all of our empathy and sympathy and action and concern, and we should all do everything that we can to help them. But there were a lot of other vulnerable groups who did not get that same treatment, as Professor Benitez noted in his comments earlier.
Dean Solorio, can I add a comment to what Anand said? I agree with everything Anand said. I just want to add one thing, that there's a similarity in my mind to the situation that Ukrainians are going through right now to what Afghans are going through as well, which is the geography to get to the United States is more of a challenge for them than it is for someone from Central America, for example. Based upon what all of us who follow this have seen, I expect that we're going to see Ukrainians traveling to South America or to Central America or to Mexico and then making the journey up to the border. So I'm assuming that in some future time, there will be more and more Ukrainians trying to enter the United States through the southern border. What will be interesting to see, that goes back to your question from earlier, Dean Solorio, how will the Ukrainians be treated as opposed to the Haitians and the Central Americans and the other vulnerable populations, all of which deserve to be treated with respect and consideration.
Thank you both. I have a question from one of our visiting scholars, Casio Casagrangi, and he's asking what changes could be made in the U.S. immigration law to protect workers that are working on the shade and for this reason are being underpaid.
So employee discrimination and taking advantage of people who are undocumented is an unfortunate reality. There are a lot of nonprofits who are doing really great work on this front with direct representation. The Legal Aid Justice Center around here is one organization that comes to mind. They actually split from legal aid many years back because they chose to represent undocumented individuals and not just people who were documented, which affected how they receive grants and federal aid. And so Legal Aid Justice Center does really great work on that. And then as far as what else can be done, I believe that that would have to be accomplished through legislation, is that we need more legislation from Congress that acknowledges this problem and protects those who are undocumented and face high levels of discrimination and exploitation.
Dean Salorio, if I could add, again, everything that Anam said, I agree with. I want to add something though. Just last night, one of our student attorneys gave a presentation to parents of students in Maryland, immigrant parents. And one of the topics of discussion was, did you know that there's this thing known as a U visa, which is a visa, a non-immigrant visa for victims of crime. And victims of crime, crime is defined broadly, expansively. And one of the things that I found very helpful based on the questions that the student received is that a lot of people said, I didn't know this, that this existed. I wasn't aware of this. And we know that in the non-citizen community, especially the non-citizen community that's out of status, you have wages being stolen. You have victims of crime who don't report it because they're afraid of being turned in. Education, if there's a way to educate people that in the employment context, for example, which is what the question is, there are wage and hour laws that protect these individuals, regardless of their immigration status, discrimination statutes. The fear always is, however, if I go and complain, they're going to turn me into immigration. They're going to call the police, which is often what the perpetrators do. Don't say anything, otherwise I'm going to turn you in. I'd like to see more education at all levels, if possible, just so people know what their rights are under the law as it is.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question from Mark Root, and the question is what you both think about the Biden administration continuing to enforce Title 42, despite now exempting unaccompanied minors.
So I can take that just because I'm unmuted already, but I believe it is one of the rightful criticisms of the Biden administration is the continuance of Title 42. And since we are speaking about Ukrainians, any Ukrainian who presents him or herself at the border to seek protection will also be subject to Title 42. So that's something that we also need to think about in light of that war and violence causing people to flee. I am not, unfortunately, optimistic that Title 42 implementation will be halted at some point. I think that if the Biden administration wanted to cease employment of that, it would have happened already. I'm just, my only source of optimism is that conditions with the pandemic seem to be improving and CDC guidance and restrictions are easing. And so that's my only light at the end of this tunnel, is that I hope that as we continue to get out of this pandemic, there will be less and less of a scientific justification to continue Title 42. But I think absent that improvement in the scientific and medical community, I don't have much confidence that the Biden administration will do much on their own to change that.
I agree.
Thank you. We have a question from Maria Florencia Regiardo, who's also one of our visiting scholars. She asked what are your thoughts on statelessness policies in the United States? And do you think it would be possible to make changes during the Biden administration?
Can I take a crack at this on them first?
Sure. Statelessness is a very interesting topic in immigration, and it affects different types of cases depending on what benefit you are seeking. So, for example, if you're statelessness and seeking asylum, you can still seek asylum. The fact that you are stateless will not prevent you from doing so. Just instead of you showing a fear of persecution to your home country, since you do not have a home country, it's your country of last habitual residence. So, and that's baked into the refugee definition, which is derived from international law and has been codified in the INA. So that's not really something that there's much wiggle room on, but it is important to know that people who are stateless are not always at a disadvantage than people who do have home countries. And it kind of comes down to the benefit that is being sought. So maybe a little more specificity to that question, could have given me a little, I could give a little bit more specific of an answer. But when I think of issues and problems in immigration law, our policy on statelessness isn't really one of the first things that comes to my mind.
I agree with Anam. Another distinguished GW alum who's a practitioner in the area, Anna Ludwikowski, did some research not that long ago. And she brought to my attention that the last amendment to the Immigration and Nationality Act, Congress passed it, the president signed it, was during the George W. Bush administration. That's the last time that the act has been amended. There's been a lot of regulations, there's been policy memos. Since then, decisions by the Attorney General, et cetera, et cetera. So I agree with Anam. I don't foresee there being any change for good or for bad to this concept of statelessness within the Immigration and Nationality Act.
Since we're almost at the end of our panel, I actually have a three-part question, and this is related to students because we have a lot of students in the room. So one part of the question is the different settings in which students can practice immigration law. The other part is how can they best prepare to practice immigration law. And the third part is advice that you have for students, when they are and eventually in the practice of immigration law.
Actually, I'm going to ask Anam to take a crack at this one, and then I'll add any comments if I have any.
Sure. So I will try and tackle all three kind of together. I do believe that the sector and setting where you are practicing immigration law makes a big difference in how you practice immigration law. There's a big difference between working at a nonprofit, working at a small firm, working at a big firm, working at a clinic, local government, federal government. And the benefit of going to school in Washington, D.C. is that you have so many ways to get really direct experience. So my advice is to seek out that experience, get as much direct experience that you can, whether it's at a clinic, whether it's an internship or externship, or even doing legal research, because you're not really going to know what is a good fit for you until and unless you try it. And you really need to take advantage of being in a city like DC, where there are so many different ways to practice immigration law. And that's kind of what I did when I was in law school. I tried working on the Hill. I worked at the clinic. I did DOJ. I tried local government, and I kind of figure out what I liked and what I didn't like. And that informed my decision-making after graduation to find a job that was a good fit for my interests and my skills. And as someone who now does a lot of our interviews and a lot of our recruiting, finding students who have experience is always much more important to me than what grade you got in torts 1L year. So saying that you did a master calendar hearing, or you've written a BIA brief on aggravated felonies, or saying that, you know certain judges, and, it speaks so much more to me about your experience and interest in immigration law. And I put those are much more of a thumb on a scale for me than what your GPA is. And I also we'll just say, I do read cover letters. So spend a lot of time on your cover letters and make sure that they're written well and persuasively, because that often shows me the type of writer that you are more than your very heavily curated and edited writing sample.
Dean Solorio, I'd like to add that I am a proponent, always have been, always will be, of people who are interested in immigration working for the government. And I think I heard Anam say that one of her internships was working for the DOJ, which makes me very happy. I didn't know that. Here is why I say that. Over the years, I've heard students say, I could never be an immigration judge because I cannot deport people. I would never be an ICE trial attorney because I could never argue in favor of having a family removed. Someone's going to make that argument. It might as well be someone that has some empathy and some sympathy. And I think those immigration lawyers here who are participating in this would agree with me when I say it's much easier to do anything when you have a reasonable opposing attorney who may not agree with your theory, but is at least willing to listen, maybe narrow issues. Not the type of attorney for the government, say, who's not even going to agree that today is Tuesday. And we're going to have to prove that today is Tuesday. It's a hard job to do, but from our side, from those of us who represent non-citizens, we don't accept every case either. We have to tell clients, look, you're a lovely family, you're a lovely person, but I just don't think that your case has merit. I cannot represent you. So you're not going to escape making these painful decisions. The issue for the students, Dean Salori, which is what you had mentioned, especially for the foreign students or students who are not citizens, there may be some issues with them being able to work or intern with the federal government if they're not US citizens. But other than that, I do recommend the path that Anam took, which is try different things, including the government. And why not? Become an immigration judge, become an asylum officer, become an adjudicator. I think it would be, we can help non-citizens in many different ways.
Thank you both so much today for your time, your wisdom, your insight, your generosity. I also share my admiration and gratitude for everything that you both do. I think when you look at the careers of both Anam and Alberto, you see professionals that embody compassion and empathy, but also a very sophisticated use of the law to help many, many, many people. And that's something that we strive for our students to do in any area of the law that they decide to pursue. So thank you so much for devoting your time to us today. I also want to thank our Immigration Law Student Association, which co-sponsored this event. I also want to thank all of you that joined us for this event today. And I want to close with a message of wellness, of health, with the hope that we have peace that comes soon, and also with the hope that we do see the needed reforms that were discussed and mentioned by our panelists today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you again.